Thank you all for coming out. I was shocked when I got here and went into the gift shop because I've been waiting. It's been 5 years since I wrote my 3-volume book on Santa Anna's Army, and I went into the gift shop and they had it. It was out. It wasn't. They had told me it would be mid-November or early December. I knew it was at the printer, and I had a copy of the cover. But they have copies here if y'all want to buy it, and I'll be glad to sign it for you. I do warn people when I sign now, I have a tremor, so I sign like a doctor, and that's appropriate now. But anyway, I can't tell you how thrilled I was when I walked in there and saw that they had my book. This is only volume 1, and I'm going to get into that later. Before I get into my lecture, I want to pass around some pictures. These are pictures of artifacts that we found up in the Sea of Mud in Wharton County near East Bernard. So those are pictures of artifacts. I want y'all to get to see all those amazing pictures. And I'm also going to pass around artifacts. These are Mexican Army artifacts from the Texas Revolution that the Mexican Army dropped in the Sea of Mud. I don't know if y'all have read my book, Sea of Mud, but there were 2,500 Mexican soldiers and 1,500 women and children and mule drivers, and there was 120 wagons, and there were 8 pieces of artillery, and they got stuck in the mud near East Bernard, Texas. And we got lucky enough to discover them. A young man found a cannonball, and the word got to me, and I went out to their place and I started metal detecting. We started finding stuff right away, and we eventually found another point on the road. So we've got about 5 miles of fields that we can metal detect, and I still go out there. I don't find much because I've been out there so much, but I want to pass these artifacts around. During the Q&A, if you have any questions about any of the artifacts, feel free to ask me about those. Now, before I start telling you about my new book, this book right here, I want to tell you about this picture. This was from the Sea of Mud, and it's an extremely rare artifact. I've been told there are only 2 of them known to exist. This is a chest plate. It's only about, this tall and about that wide, and it went on the soldier's chest. And it would hold the 2 leather straps that held the bayonet scabbard and the cartridge box. Those 2 leather straps, it would hold them in place. And this one, if you look carefully, it says Jimenez. And the Jimenez Battalion was one of the regular Army units, one of the permanent units that fought in the Texas Revolution. And there were only 2 battalions, the Jimenez Battalion and the San Luis Battalion, that fought both at the Alamo and at Goliad. Right after the Alamo fell, they were sent to reinforce General Urrea at Goliad. So they fought both places. So the soldier that dropped this in the mud, and I was the next person to touch it after he dropped it, the soldier that dropped it in the mud fought at the Alamo and he fought at Goliad. And he obviously survived because he made it to the Sea of Mud, but he lost his chest plate. Okay. This is a 3-volume book. What happened was I got a link to a website from Dr. Roger Moore, the archaeologist, and he linked me up to a site that the Mexican government had put online to celebrate their 200th anniversary. And what they did, they took photos and digitalized their entire military archives. and it was about 200,000 documents. And I got all excited when he sent me that link, and I started going through them. I went through all 200,000 documents. They were almost all of them handwritten in Spanish, but I had learned enough Spanish when I was writing my Sea of Mud book that I could speak to my patients in Spanish, and also that I could tell pretty much what the documents said and they were about. I found about 2,000 of the 200,000 that had to do with Texas history. And of those, I took about 200 and I put them in my 3 volumes. So there's about 200 documents, and I would feel safe in saying that the majority of these have never been seen before. And even if they had been seen, they hadn't been translated. So I found some really fascinating stuff, and what I wanted to do was tell you about the documents that I used in my first volume, this book that's out. Volume 1 is 1835, Volume 2 is 1836, and it includes the Alamo and the Battle of Perdido. I put Perdido on there because that's what the Mexican Army called it. And this book's about the Mexican Army. So the Battle of Perdido, or Colado Creek, the Texans called it. That was the Fannin Battle. And so both of those are included. There's a lot more besides just the Alamo and the Goliad fight. I've got a chapter on the invasion of Texas by the Americans. I've got maritime activities, the navies, what they were up to. I've got a bunch of other stuff besides that. Volume 3, to put it briefly, is the Battle of San Jacinto and the aftermath. I've got quite a bit on Santa Anna being a prisoner. I've got quite a bit on the prisoners of war, the Mexican prisoners of war, and what they were up to. And so there's also maritime in Volume 3. So keep your eyes peeled for Volume 2 and Volume 3. Now, what documents did I use? Well, I used a lot of documents, believe me. The documents from that web page were the Archivo Histórico Militar, the military archives of Mexico. So that's the one that had about 200,000 documents. Then also in Austin, I found the Archivo General de la Nación. There was a lot of Mexican Army artifacts in that collection in Austin. There were multiple other Mexican sources. I've got a lot of the published ones, but a lot of unpublished ones as well. There was a guy named Núñez Ortiz who wrote a diary. It's never been published. And there were several other accounts of different people that I found that have never been published before. I spent quite a bit of time in Austin and Galveston, even Richmond-Rosenberg. They have quite a few documents there in Richmond-Rosenberg. I tried my best not to use Texan or American sources. I wanted this book, this series, to be about the Mexican Army. I didn't want to confuse people with what the Texans said. If you read Texas history books, you're going to find quite a few inaccuracies regarding the Mexican Army. And just to give you an example of the inaccuracies, and will be in Volume 2, and I'll document it well. But after the Battle of the Alamo, there was a general that was assigned to come up with a list of all the casualties from the Mexican Army, and he waited for reports from each unit. Each unit gave him their report. And the lowest number that I can find in any Texas history books of Mexicans that died at the Alamo is 500. And this Mexican general, he wrote that there were 62 killed and 290 wounded. And I've got a lot of backup documentation. I found the daily log of the San Luis Battalion. And in their daily log, they listed the names of their dead and wounded. And it exactly matches this Mexican general's deal. So more and more people are beginning to accept the fact that there weren't 500 Mexicans killed. I've seen as high as 2,000, but there weren't 2,000 attacked the Alamo. There were about 1,250, maybe 1,500 attacked the Alamo. So it'd be pretty hard for 2,000 of them to be dead if there were only 1,500 attacked. But anyway, that just gives you an idea about the Texas history. They always say history is written by the winners, and I read somewhere one of the famous Texans from way back said the Texans were busy making history, not documenting it. But the Mexicans were great at documenting everything. When they would write a letter, one general would write a letter to another general, they would make a copy and send it to the Secretary of War. And that's what we found in these archives that were posted online. I found some very interesting documents. One was in this Mexican newspaper, El Telegrafo, and it was dated December 30th, 1833. I found the letter that Stephen F. Austin wrote to the Ayuntamiento, the city council of Béjar, and he wrote it October 2nd, 1833, okay? And he, in that document, said, I don't think we're going to get Texas independent as a state, but go ahead and have the different cities set up their own councils and their own government, and go ahead and basically set up a government, even though Mexico's not going to recognize Texas as independent from Coahuila. Okay, so that was his letter written in Spanish, and I think I have it translated. And then I found their response, the Ayuntamiento's response to Stephen F. Austin. They wrote it October 31st, 1833. And in that letter, they wrote, the city council, that this corporate body neither can nor should nor even wishes to follow the aforementioned suggestion about setting up their own government. It begs that you stop writing to it regarding this matter, as you well know that these communications compromise the obeying of the orders and the laws of the state that must be obeyed. So they told him, don't write like this anymore. This is bad. And just to protect themselves, I'm guessing, they sent a copy of his original orders, and they sent a copy of their response to the Mexican government. Stephen F. Austin had already left Mexico City by the time the Mexican government got it, and he was on his way home, but he hadn't gotten out of Mexico, and they arrested him and put him in prison for a couple of years. So we've got the letters that caused him to end up in prison. Okay. I wanted to get also into the minds of the Mexican soldiers. What were they thinking? What were they doing? What was their response to all of this? I found a letter from Antonio Tenorio. He was the commander at Anahuac. And there were some disturbances there. The Texans and the Mexican soldiers got crosswise. Eventually, the Mexican soldiers surrendered and marched back towards Mexico. But in this, and this is from this link, AHM is Archivo Histórico Militar. Anyway, Tenorio said, I beg your excellency that if an expedition is formed with the purpose of punishing and of subduing the pride of these colonists, send me, even if it is in the class of a simple soldier, for I have the greatest desire to battle these true enemies of the fatherland. The Mexicans were not very happy that the Texans came in here and started trying to call the shots and resisting them and everything. They were given land at a very cheap price. They were, they swore to be Mexican citizens, and it wasn't going well, and they were pretty upset. this same guy, Antonio Tenorio, is the guy that surrendered the troops at Anahuac. And the surrender actually took place in a thicket, they said. And that was June 27th, 1835. I've got the document in there. I've got the capitulation in the book. And he wrote then to Ugarteche, who was the commander, the Mexican commander in San Antonio or Bejar, and he gave a report of the conflict at Anahuac on July 7th, and I've got that in there. And I had Manuel Hinojosa, my friend who's my illustrator, he's the one that drew this picture on the front of the book. He did a picture for me of Tenorio and William Barrett Travis in a thicket exchanging the agreement to surrender. Okay. Now, I also found 5 documents. I don't know how many of you know, but there was a Mexican courier was captured on June 21st near San Felipe. And there were 5 documents that he had, and the Texans got a hold of them. And one of those documents really set off the Texans, because one of those documents said that the Mexican army was marching into Texas. And this didn't sit well with the Texans. So I think that was what really blew the lid off the conflict, is that the Texans found out that the Mexican army was coming to Texas. And so we got all 5 of those documents. I also found a long letter from Santa Anna to Tornell. Tornell was the Secretary of War. I found a long letter dealing with the actions that were to be taken to regain the control of Texas. And so Santa Anna wrote this long letter to the Secretary of War about what they should do. I found another interesting letter from Vital Fernandez. He was the commander at Matamoros. And he wrote this letter on November 11th, 1835, and he ordered a bunch of cloth for uniforms. And I thought this was interesting because he described the uniforms, and I thought the reenactors would really appreciate this. So I put that in the book about what he ordered as far as cloth for uniforms. Next slide. Okay. I found a couple of broadsides that to me helped explain the feelings of the Mexicans from all this. And I found this broadside from Luis Quintanar to the troops, and it's dated November 13th, 1835. And he wrote a circular about the terrible actions of the Texans, and he wrote to his subordinates. And he wrote, "Soldiers, a miserable portion of adventurers and hypocrite settlers in Texas have dared to set foot hostily in some of the towns of that territory. In these towns, the magnanimous Mexican nation with liberal hands gave hospitality to those same monsters that today attempt to subjugate and usurp one of the richest parts of its richest ground." So I always tell people, the Mexicans were trying to save Texas for Mexico. You know, you can't hardly blame them for that. I'm not an apologist. I don't go back and apologize for the settlers. They were from America, and they were used to a different form of government. And they weren't happy with some of the, especially after Santa Anna took over as dictator. They were originally supposedly in favor of the Constitution of 1824, which was written similarly to the American Constitution. But Santa Anna basically threw that out the window. So I always tell people, if you think about it, if a bunch of Canadians in Minnesota started an uprising and the Texas National Guard went up there to put down the uprising to save Minnesota for the United States, the Texas National Guard would not be bad guys. They were not bad guys. We're just trying to save Minnesota for the United States. And that's what the Mexican soldiers were doing. Next slide. I also found a very interesting a report, especially for the Alamo experts. There are a lot of people that thought that the Mexican army had these Congreve rockets, and they had the Mexican government had ordered to send 100 of them to the army to take with them to the Alamo. And I found that documented that they were going to take 100 with them. But I found this result of the testing. They tested the rockets before they sent them. And it said the first rocket, as it exited the tube in which it was placed, left its trajectory because one of the elevation that it was given, while in the air, the fire burned with such a fast velocity that it finished its course at a distance of 20 varas, which would be about 60 feet, which they probably wouldn't have fired that close to the Alamo. The same happened with the second rocket. The third advanced up to 50 varas, so that's still only 150 feet at most. But none of the three grenades which were in their heads exploded. So they had grenades in the head of the rockets, and none of the three grenades exploded. One had its tail broken off, and the tubes of all three were destroyed. So after reading that report, my guess is they decided not to send those rockets. I've not found any documentation in the Mexican archives of them using rockets. I have found documentation of them using flares, but not rockets. Okay, next slide. I found three declarations of guys that were involved in the conflict, the naval conflict between the Correo de Mexico and the Americans. And these three guys, two of them were on the crew of Tommy Thompson, and that sounds like that would be one of the American ships, but it wasn't. Tommy Thompson was an Englishman, and he was the captain of the Correo de Mexico. So he was the captain of the Mexican ship, and they were captured by the Texans, and they actually took the ship and went all the way to New Orleans and had a trial. One of the soldiers was a Mexican, Jimenez, who escaped the capture, and all three of them got into a small sloop, and they managed to get back to Brazos de Santiago, which was the port of Matamoros. And it's interesting that I found in another source that they quoted the capture of the Correo as one of the reasons that they needed to get the come and take it cannon. They said, after this conflict, it's obvious that we better get that cannon back. So this is one of the things that stimulated the Mexican army to try to get the come and take it cannon back. Austin was on the San Felipe, which was one of the ships that captured, but he had already disembarked before the conflict arose. Next slide. This is one of my favorite documents that I ran across. I found it at the Benson Library, and that's the Hispanic library in Austin at the University of Texas. And I was going through some papers, family papers. They just have folders and folders of family papers. And I found this little document that you can see on the right. And for some reason, I looked at the signature, and the signature was Francisco Castañeda. And I said, wait a minute, I know that guy. He was the commander of the cavalry troops at the Battle of Gonzales. Then I looked at the date. It was October 2nd, 1835. And he wrote it that afternoon. This was his battle report that he sent back to San Antonio, to Behar, to Ugartecha. And he wrote it that day. And he said, today at 5 a.m, I was attacked at the habitation of La Pera by 200 Americans, more or less. And then he said one thing that I had been researching a lot on. He said they had one medium piece, which was a cannon, and they had one piece, a small piece of ordnance, which they called Esmeril. I had to look up Esmeril. I had no idea what Esmeril was. But anyway, the people at Gonzales are not very happy with me because I have a lot of documentation, and I think this really seals it, that the come and take it cannon was not that little bitty cannon that they had. I found a document that one of the guys in San Antonio sent to Green DeWitt and said, we're sending a wagon and we hope it's big enough to carry the cannon. And it's like that little bitty cannon that they have in Gonzales, that they wouldn't have needed a wagon for that. It weighs 79 pounds. But a medium-sized piece, a 6-pounder, would probably weigh about 1,300 pounds. So I think I've got a lot of documentation that the come and take it cannon was a brass, probably 6-pounder. I found one document from one of the city councilmen in Behar saying that, hey, there's a 6-pounder over at the government house, let's send that one. And I found the response of the military commander, and it wasn't Ugarteche at the time, but he said, yeah, go ahead and send that 6-pounder. So we're pretty sure that was the come and take it cannon. I don't think the Texans would have been too worried about that little bitty cannon that they had. It was basically a signal cannon. But anyway, I was just fascinated when I found that document. It's amazing how much stuff there is in these folders that have not been found before. People need to do the research. Next slide. Okay. I found a bunch of documents. One was October 5th, and General Coase, who now was in Texas, he wrote a very honest letter about how bad things were in Texas. And he said that they needed 2,000 men to be sent right away or they would lose Texas. And they eventually did send that many, but they lost it anyway. And then I found multiple documents, and these are all in the book, translated, regarding the taking of Goliad by the Texans on October 9th and 10th. That's some fascinating stuff in that. And then from November 5th, I found a report from the military commander of Fort Lipan, which is on the Nueces River. I've actually done archaeology there with the state. The state invited us to go out and do metal detecting there. And we did find some stuff. But Lieutenant Nicholas Rodriguez was the commander there, and he had been sent up to Goliad because Goliad had been taken by the Texans. So they sent him up there to find out what was going on. And on his way back, they had a conflict with the Texans. And then he eventually made it back to Lipan and found out that it had been captured by the Texans. And he ended up going a little further south. He was one of the last units left in Texas of the Mexican army. Next slide. This is from a letter that Stephen F. Austin, and once again, this is from one of the Americans, but I put some stuff in there from Americans if I found it in the Mexican military archives, because I figured I could make the argument that this helped form the ideas of the Mexican government. So it affected that if the Mexican government was aware of these things, then it had an effect. So Austin wrote to Ugarteche on September 15th, it should say 35. I'm sorry, that's a mistake. Austin now was back from being in prison, and he had found out that Mexican troops were moving to Texas, and this was his deal. He said to Ugarteche, yet on the other hand, what are the military measures? Honey in the mouth and daggers in the hand? My friend, I do not think that this is the way to deal with the people. It is my duty on behalf of openness to say that public opinion will consider the march of troops into the colonies in the present circumstances as a declaration of war, and that neither I nor anyone else can prevent the consequences. Stephen F. Austin had been fairly loyal to the Mexican government, but now it's obvious that he's thinking, that's not a good idea to send troops here. Next slide. The Battle of Concepcion was part of the Siege of Behar. And the Siege of Behar, a lot of people are not aware that the Texans captured Behar, San Antonio, and the Alamo in 1835. Okay? Cos was the commander there. Most Texas history books tell you that Cos was Santa Anna's brother-in-law. And I'm pretty sure that was not the case. I found a lot of documents that disprove that. There was a colonel in the Mexican army who was a brother-in-law, and I'm forgetting his name now, but anyway, there was another guy, but it wasn't Cos. But anyway, Cos was in charge in San Antonio during the Battle of Concepcion. And this Rafael Ugarteche, which is not the Ugarteche who was commander, it was his brother. He was the cavalry commander, and he wrote his battle report on October 28th. And then there was another battle report of the Battle of Concepcion by Lieutenant Colonel Jose Maria Mendoza. He was an infantry officer on Cos's staff. And so we have his battle report of the Battle of Concepcion. And then we have Cos's battle report that he didn't write till the next day, October 29th. So we've got 3 battle reports from the Battle of Concepcion, and I don't think that any of the 3 have ever been seen before. Next slide. I also found in the archives several lists, and this list on the right was dated October 28th. There were actually 2 lists from Condell. He was the commander of the Morelos Battalion, and this list right here on the right is the list of the dead and captured from the Morelos Battalion at the Battle of Concepcion. The Morelos Battalion was the only permanent unit that was involved in the Siege of Behar. The rest of them were militias or activo units. But this is a list, and I made sure to put these guys' names on them. I tried to use as many names of the Mexican soldiers as I could, because I thought genealogists would appreciate that. And I thought, out of respect, they deserve to have their names in the history books. So these are the guys that were dead or captured at the Battle of Concepcion from the Morelos Battalion. Next slide. This is a picture that my illustrator, Manuel Hinojosa, did for me, and that's the Battle of Concepcion. The Mexicans had a cannon, but they abandoned it. So they did lose their cannon at the Battle of Concepcion. Next slide. I found several other documents having to do with the Siege of Behar. January 14th, Sanchez gave a list of the names of dead and wounded from 7 of the Presidio companies that fought at Behar. 5 of them didn't ever turn in the names, but we have the names of 7 of the Presidio companies. December 13th, 1835, Barragan wrote to Santa Anna, and he gave a report for the commander of the Presidio company. He was the commander, of the Presidio company of Rio Grande, and he gives the details of what was going on during the siege and why he and his company left Behar. Some people would say he deserted, but I think that he realized that it was a lost cause and they weren't going to win, so they just left. And he was writing to Santa Anna explaining to him why he left. And then I found another document from Galan to Santa Anna explaining why he and his company, the Agua Verde company, left Behar. So several of those companies, they just took off. They just left. Next. After Coast surrendered, and the Texans let them go. They didn't keep them as prisoners or anything, but he wrote, after he surrendered at Laredo, Juan Sanchez Navarro, who had been involved in the siege of Behar, he was the commander of the reinforcements that came up. The reinforcements, unfortunately, were almost all rookie troops and guys that they had taken control of on their way north. So the Mexicans said the reinforcements were a detriment, that all they did was eat food and they didn't help in the battle at all. But anyway, Sanchez Navarro was the commander of the reinforcements, so he was involved in the Battle of Behar, the siege of Behar, and Sanchez Navarro wrote that a few braggarts claimed that the Dolores Regiment alone was sufficient to defeat the colonists. Just one battalion one group of cavalry was sufficient. Sanchez had faced the Texans and knew what good fighters they were. His response was how foolish that he would say that. General Sesma claimed that, this was Ramirez y Sesma, claimed that with 100 lancers, he could remove the colonists. And Sanchez, his reply to him, to Sesma was, God, I hope so, but I doubt it. So, once again, I think it's very interesting to get into the minds of the Mexicans. I think this last slide proves that the Mexicans, when they started from Mexico, they were way overconfident. They didn't expect the Texans to put up much of a fight at all, and they thought they could whip them easily. And they had thousands of troops, and there was a good reason for them to believe that it wouldn't be much of a fight, but it turned out to be a little bit more serious than what they expected. All right. Thank y'all.